That's why if you look at the Quran, one of the most famous scenes in the Quran is when Muhammad returns to Mecca after being exiled in Medina, and one of the first things he does when he marches back into Mecca is go into the Kaaba, which is that big square obelisk, and he destroys all of the idols of the false gods in there, with the exception of a tapestry of Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary, which he preserved. Now, in addition to this idea of prohibition of worshiping false idols that they picked up from the Jewish tribes there, it's even more emphasis within the Islamic faith, because there's this idea that only God can create life. One of the most famous prayers in Islam is something called the Shahada. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And when you're indoctrinated into Islam to join the faith, you recite this in front of a witness. Now, because of this stricture, it's one of the most sacred prayers within Islam, and violating that is a severe sin called shirk. And shirk is something that exists at many different levels. So, for example, to boss somebody around in Islam is a sin, a low level of shirk, because only God has the right to direct people. And you should not be directing people or allow yourself to be bossed around by another person, because that is considered to be a sin. And I'm sure you've heard people even here in America say, someone's throwing their weight around and say, who does he think he is? Jesus Christ Almighty, you know? Well, if you were a Muslim, you'd say, hey, that's a sin to do something like that. So as a result, they came up with other different types of artwork that were not representational, because to draw a figure or draw a human figure is to create life, and only God can create life. So as a result, they came up with something we're familiar with called arabesque. They called it aslimi. And if you look at it closely, what it resembles is these kind of geometric forms, and a lot of the things in there look like kind of floral shapes there, okay? Now, how this came about is fascinating. In early Islam, they were keen, the Arabs, on preserving the knowledge of the ancient Greeks. All of the Greek knowledge that we have today was preserved by the Arabs. The translations we have of Greek things that exist in Latin and English weren't translated from original Greek. They were translated from Arabic, because they were the one that transcribed all the ancient Greek writings and preserved it. And they not only preserved it, but they built on a lot of the ancient Greek knowledge. They were particularly fascinated with the Greek study of geometry, and they took this to new levels. For example, the word algebra is an Arabic word. They created algebra. They also created the concept of zero, and they gave us our base 10 system and the basis of a lot of mathematics today. If you look at famous mathematicians over at the University of Rochester or Rochester Institute of Technology, you'd see an awful lot of people there from the Middle East, Turkish and Iranian scholars that are the professors there. They saw this as something that was spiritual that they were working on when they were advancing these fields of mathematics, because to them, this was proof of God's design of the universe. These special relationships that made everything proportional and equal and everything laid out so magically, to them was proof that God had designed the world and the universe around us. Now, the other element that was sacred to them was the concept of plants, because the Quran teaches that God gave a gift to man of the riches of the earth. And one of the key riches that they saw was plants. And you would think plants were a magical thing, especially if you lived where they lived in the deserts. They saw oases in the deserts as almost a picture of heaven, to see these luscious green plants in the water that was there. The other thing that they looked at when they were trying to preserve the knowledge of ancient Greece was they're fascinated with the pottery, especially with the pottery that was done by the Greeks that used geometric art forms, because this kind of parlayed into the study of geometry and this kind of grand design of Allah for the creation of the world. So to create the arabesque, what they did is they looked at the geometric art of the Greeks, and then they added to that some complex mathematics, looking at God's design, as well as this concept of God's gift with the floral designs, and they came up with arabesque. Now, creating an arabesque design is incredibly complex, probably more so than you thought. I'm going to show you a short video, and it shows someone actually doing the underlying drawing for this type of a star arabesque. And you can see how precise and how painstaking the calculations and then the angles are to do this. Now this is to create a simple star arabesque. Look at something more complex, where you can imagine every square inch of these other designs had to be done this way. Almost boggles the mind to think about the mathematical precision required to do those complex designs on these buildings. That's why when you look at arabesque, and they refer to it as Islami, it looks incredibly complex, yet it never looks cluttered. It has a very clean look to it, and that's because of the extreme symmetry and balance that they were able to achieve by using the mathematics to lay the designs out. Now, one of the things you'll see in this particular design is, in addition to the arabesque, you will see calligraphy. You will see calligraphy in this area over here and over here. And Islamic calligraphy is something that you'll see a lot on the various buildings, and is key part of Islamic art. I mean, they'll have entire buildings covered with this type of calligraphy. And it is seen as a very spiritual representation, because the Quran is considered the exact word of Allah. And so those words in Arabic carry great spiritual meaning for them. And as I mentioned, you could have entire buildings covered from top to bottom with this calligraphy, it's a unique form of Islamic architecture. And it evolved quite a bit. If you look at early Arab script, they use what's called these kufu, or these angular hard styles of Arabic script. Sometimes they're called the dry style. And it evolved over time to what they call softer styles. Here are softer styles of Arabic script. And the amazing thing is when you're looking at this script is when you look at this and you look at this, it's all the exact same phrase. And you can see how much it varies by changing just the style of the script. Here's a very early copy of the Quran from 7th century, very early script. It's interesting, but it's not necessarily extremely artistic. And then we move up to the 8th century, and you can see how different it is. And then moving into the 9th century, how different it is. And again, this is the same passage from the Quran. So it's almost baffling to say, well, gee, how is it possible that the text could look so different and it's supposed to be the same thing? Well, the reason for that is in early Arabic script, it wasn't proportional. Our alphabet is proportional today. I mean, we take it for granted that if you look at the tops of the letters, they all line up, and the bottoms of the letters line up, and the lowercase kind of lines up, and then the width of the letters line up. None of those proportions held as rules in early Arabic script. And so it could have this very wide range of what it could look like. But this got settled down about 900 CE by Ibn Muqwa. He was the secretary of the vizier. And he thought to himself, you know, we really need to come up with a proportional system. I mean, we're looking at what we're doing with Arabesque, and we're doing all these mathematics to keep things proportional and equal. Why don't we apply the same to Arabic script? It'd be easier to read, maybe it'll look nicer. So he came up with a system. And Arab calligraphy was done with these type of reed pens. And if you look at that particular word, it's got those little diamonds on it. And that's the little triangles that are kind of smushed together to make a diamond. And last week when I spoke about Arabic being a Semitic language and similar to ancient Hebrew, and one of the reasons it gets difficult to interpret those languages is they left out the vowels. And you had to fill in the vowels. They just put down the consonants from the context and usage of what you were reading. Well, the Arabs started filling in the vowels. And one of the ways they started filling in the vowels was through those little patterns of these diamonds they would put down. So Muqwa said, well, what we'll do is I'll come up with a system to make it proportional based upon these little diamonds that we're inserting for the vowels. So anything that is a straight line going up, it has to be 5 diamonds high. And something else that was curved has to be 5 diamonds and 2 diamonds high. And he came up with these various formulas using the diamonds to make the Arab script proportional. And he came up with a system, and the vizier liked it, and he generated this nice 30-volume, copy of the Quran using it, but it never caught on that much. People didn't think it was that much of an improvement artistically in what they were looking at to kind of go through the trouble of doing his system of writing. Well, that changed when this fellow came along, Ibn Abdullah. The name means son of a doorman, and he wasn't in high society. As a matter of fact, he was a house painter as a living. And he was working in the house of Muqwa, doing painting, doing some work, and it so happens that Muqwa's daughter thought that he was really cute. So she wanted to get to know him better, and she said, well, let me teach you something. And she knew her father's system of how he did these kind of dots. He taught his family the system. So she instructed Bawa on this system of how to do this proportional calligraphy. And then a little while later, Bawa was doing some painting in the home of the ruler of the Shiraz, the Grand Vizier at that time. And the Grand Vizier, came in to check on how the paint job was doing, and Bawa was waiting for the coat of paint to dry, so he was sitting in the corner and he was practicing his calligraphy, and he was using this system with the dots. And the vizier looked at it and he was shocked because he says, hey, this calligraphy is identical to what Muqwa did when he gave me this, set of Quran, this 30-volume set. It's the same thing. He pulled out a book that looked identical. And he said to Bawa, you know something? I loaned one of these volumes to somebody and I never got it back. How you're never supposed to loan a book out to someone, you don't get it back? Well, that's what the vizier did. And he said, my collection's all goofed up. Could you generate this other volume so the collection could get complete again? Because by this time, Muqwa had passed away. So Bawa generated this other volume for him, and the vizier was so pleased, and it looked so fantastic, he couldn't tell the difference between the other volumes. He said, you're no longer a house painter. From now on, you're my secretary. And he appointed him a Grand Vizier's secretary, and he went on making copies of these Qurans. He made a total of 64 of them in total, all from memory, as a matter of fact, with this new form of script that he started embellishing a little bit more. Because not only was he a house painter, but he was kind of a frustrated artist. So he took Muqwa's stuff to the next level to make it much more artistic. Well, we only have one copy that exists today of one of Bawa's 64 Qurans that he generated, and this is a page of it. And in addition to the Arabic script that you can see, he did a lot of different ornamentation to it. And people were so taken that they thought Bawa's stuff was so beautiful, then proportional writing became the norm within Islam for recording the Quran. Now, the other thing that made Arabic calligraphy take off, Islamic calligraphy take off as an art form, was the advance in papermaking. Now, the stuff you learned in school that Marco Polo brought back the knowledge of papermaking to Europe? That was a lot of baloney. He did. He came back and he told people that he saw this magical thing of paper, but he had no idea how to make it. He didn't instruct anybody in making paper. The way paper came into Europe was as the Arab Empire expanded. They expanded into regions where they were getting contiguous with China. And they started getting into conflict, and they had some major fights, especially around 751 with the Chinese. And at this time, the Arabs took as prisoners a whole bunch of Chinese. And some of the people among the Chinese were paper makers. And if you were taken prisoner, you could be digging a ditch, or you could say, hey, I got a magical thing I want to show you. And that's what the paper makers did. And they instructed the Arabs on how to make paper. And the Arabs improved on this even more, because rather than just using rice to make the paper, they knew how to make other compounds. And then by the time that 1100 rolled around, the Moors introduced this knowledge into Europe. And then that's how we got paper making in Europe. Now, why was paper making so important in terms of Arab calligraphy? Well, prior to that, people would write on parchment, they'd write on vellum. And if you ever see these old drawings and illustrations of someone writing, stuff onto parchment or vellum, they'll have this pen, but they'll also have like a little knife in the other hand. Because if there was some type of mistake, they could take the knife and easily scratch it out. Because of the oils that existed in the parchment and vellum, because it was animal skins, the ink would not penetrate. So it was almost like wax paper. We could easily scrape something off. Well, that's good if you want to erase something, but it's bad if you want to preserve a document, a legal document, or, for example, for the Muslims where they wanted to preserve the word of God and make sure it was unalterable. So they wanted to make sure that when they wrote down copies of the Quran or copies of writings from that no one could alter it. The last thing they wanted someone to do is go over and start some new religious sect or something else, or blasphemize something by altering the words of the Quran. So paper was key for them to feel safe in writing down words of the Quran and writing down copies of the Quran. Also, it was less expensive, and it protected the Quran, as we spoke. Now, calligraphy was a key part of religious art, and even the creation of it requires a lot of judgment. And even though it's proportional, it requires a lot of artistic bent. And I'll play a video here. I hope it's going to play okay. And it's a calligrapher, Arab calligrapher, Islamic calligrapher, talking about how they go about creating calligraphy.
Growing under the Islamic produced calligraphy in its sophisticated form that we follow until today. We use strong rules and very tight regulations. Sometimes you can see it clearly because it's tiny in relation to the size of your body. But you see it, you know it's exactly the same way in letters. That's what makes calligraphy very challenging, and sometimes you call it as labor-intensive art because it takes a lot of sheet paper. And the combinations of some letters with others are very hard. Names in Arabic, words in Arabic, which are very hard to write. Long words in Arabic, which I was writing recently, and the problem with words is that it's such a long word that half of my composition. So half of my composition is even one word, and half 7 other words fit in. It's just like trying to get on, trying to get them to sit and sometimes because each one starts from a different angle, and you have to. It's like the points, you have to break them up. But at the end, the more experience you are, the more you become with letters. Letters actually speak part of the one, except to sit next to something they want to say. So I think the skill of the.
For example, here is calligraphy written out for the Shahada. There is no God, but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Here's the exact same words, the exact same Shahada done by another artist. Here's another version. Here's another version. If you look at this version, it looks a lot like Chinese calligraphy. And that's because since they were contiguous with China and many of the Arab lands, they shared knowledge, and there's different forms of Arab calligraphy that are based off of Chinese calligraphy. Here's another example. And it could range from things that look very, very complex to things that look extraordinarily simple. Looks like a candelabra. Even simpler still. Here's a colored version of it. Now, even though I spoke about this prohibition of idols, yet there's nothing in the Quran that explicitly prohibits representational art. I mean, you can't go into the Quran any place where it says, you shall not do representational art. It was just kind of inferred. So when I spoke before last week about Christian art and how the painting techniques were regulated in terms of iconography from church officials, it's a little more difficult to do that throughout the Islamic Empire because the central caliphate that existed in Islam broke up fairly early into these individual caliphates that had somewhat of a lot of autonomy. So they could kind of come up with their own rules. So what they kind of said was that, well, you know, we've got this prohibition. Okay, idea that God can only create life. Well, what if we created something and we didn't make it lifelike? Okay, so for example, if you looked at an image, here's Prince Valiant, you know, done by Hal Foster, the famous cartoonist. And, you know, he's seen as a cartoonist that does very realistic images because he does a lot of modeling. You know, he puts shadows and different three-dimensional effects on the face where it looks like a real person, but it doesn't look anything like Dagwood Bumstead. I mean, Dagwood Bumstead doesn't look like a real person because they leave off all of the shadows, they leave off all of the modeling that makes it look, give it dimensional. He looks like a non-real cartoon person. And so that's what they started to do in certain areas of Islam with putting in representational art. They would include human and animal figures, but they would not do any type of shadow and modeling. So they look kind of like cutouts, cartoon cutouts put on the painting. So if you look at these areas, has some depth and it looks like there's shadows, yet there's nothing over here. And it's not because the artist wasn't skilled enough, he's purposely leaving these out to not make them lifelike. So it's not a crime, a sin of shirk in terms of violating creating life. Here's something else, it shows it. And this is a picture of Muhammed Preaching, and this is an extremely rare painting because generally Muhammad's face is never shown in Islamic art. Not because he's considered any type of divinity, because the Quran makes that clear, he's not to be worshipped, but just out of respect, just out of respect for the Prophet. So as a result, when you see a painting, Islamic painting, and someone's face is obscured, in this case, if you look on the right-hand side, and you see this fellow's face obscured by flames, you know right away that that is Muhammad, because his face is obscured. Or the more popular convention that you'll see is this next one. Well, you'll see a veil over Muhammad's face. In this case, they even drape his sleeves down so you can't even see his hands, okay? Now, the people who were doing calligraphy in these areas where they're allowing representational images started to do representational things with calligraphy as well. So now we have in those areas people generating calligraphy that looks like this. That's actually iron cut out. Now, I have to mention to you that these representational figures are only done within certain countries within Islam. And that's one of the key divisions between the Shia and the Sunni. The Shia and also the Sufi will tend to use representational images. The Sunni still regard that as shirk and look down upon that particular practice. So when you're looking to crack the code of Islamic art, what you want to keep in mind is the sacred plan where they use geometry, the sacred gifts where they use the floral images, the sacred word where they're using calligraphy, and also these less lifelike figures that they do in certain areas of Islam. Well, I would like to switch back to Christianity for a little bit. We have Easter coming up tomorrow, so I think it's appropriate we switch back. And I want to speak a little bit about everything you ever wanted to know about halos. Now, the idea of using halos goes way, way, way back. You can go back to the Greeks, where Apollo is circling the sun in his chariot, and he's got this kind of a sun halo behind him. And there was Ra, the sun god. Poor guy's got to walk around with this big sun on his head all the time. And in Hinduism, there was the goddess, Surya, who's the sun god. And she's driven on a chariot pulled by her consort across the sky with the sun. And of course, if we look at a king's crown that was done among many of the areas of Europe, they have those spikes on it, which was to represent a halo, the sun coming out. So the Christians adopted this practice, but they didn't want to be seen as pagan and copy those types of things. So the rule came up that they wanted to keep it circular, not with these rays coming out, like they saw the Greeks doing with Apollo or on the crown or with the Hindus. So you can see some early examples of halos here. You can see these circular halos. And this one got goofed up somehow. Artist maybe had too much to drink by the time he got to the end of the painting. Oh, wait, there's another one. Looks kind of the same, kind of looks different, doesn't it? Hey, there's another one like this. So, what's with the square halos? Those weren't accidents, those were intentional, that they put square halos on those people. Well, a square halo was used for people who were still alive when the likeness was made. So in this example, what you're looking at is Pope Leo VII. And when he was alive, he led this big campaign to add this chapel onto St. Peter's Basilica. And he was so revered, people thought he was just destined for sainthood. It was just, he was a shoo-in for sainthood. So while he was alive, they put this square halo on with the idea that, well, when he dies, he's going to be represented with halos anyhow. Now, this was something that was unique to Italians who did this Italian art. And the square was supposed to represent earth, while the circle symbolizes heaven. So if you look, for example, at the virtues, there's 7 virtues in total. 4 of them are from Plato's Republic. They're called the cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. And you'll often see these things displayed outside a courthouse someplace. But there's also the 3 heavenly graces mentioned in Corinthians: faith, hope, and then you either say love or charity. Now, Plato's are earthly bound, and the ones from Corinthians are more divine from heaven. So when you see Plato's virtues pictured, you have these kind of hexagonal, squarish looking halos. And here it is, here's another picture. Again, you could see these kind of hexagonal ones. Prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. I don't know if you can guess from these pictures which is which. Like, for example, if we want justice, it is probably this lady here, right? Holding the law books. And temperance is this lady dumping out all this good booze, right? Fortitude means courage. And it would be this lady over here, she's praying for courage. And that what she's doing is, that's called orans, that method of prayer. And that was the primary method of prayer in Christianity for about the first 1,200 years. They primarily did orans. That was done by a lot of ancient people for prayer. Ancient Hebrews did that, and also a lot of other ancient religions did that. The Christians adopted that very early because to them that kind of looked like Christ on the cross. And up to about 1200, that was the main way people prayed. And then after that, then they started holding hands when they prayed, and they came up with this kind of method of praying. This orans has made a big comeback in the 20th century because the Pentecostalists and Charismatic sects started using it, and it started catching on. And now you'll look at these different televangelists and such, and you'll see them praying like with this symbol. And of course, our last one before I forget, prudence, looking at all sides of things. You can see this woman has like different faces. She's being circumspect and looking at all sides of stuff. But you can see these kind of but hexagonal type halos. And if you look at the heavenly graces, faith, hope, and charity, you can see them being from heaven. They have the circular halos. Now, there is another angular one that's a triangular one, and that's kind of reserved for God the Father. You don't see a lot of paintings of God the Father, but when he is shown, he is generally shown with this triangular halo. Right? And here's the Holy Spirit, the dove with a circular, and Jesus Christ. And you can see this little kind of a triangular shape within Jesus Christ's halo. And that is known as a cruciform halo. And that's generally reserved for representations of Jesus Christ. You could see it here again. And so many times when you see that cruciform halo, you'll see little letters that are contained within it. See little letters, these Greek letters? What those represent is this Greek letter O represents the word I, and these two letters represent am. You know, I am who I am, which is this thing that God says to Moses. And it's actually put there to identify a particular type of Christology. We spoke about that last time. People were arguing about what was the true nature of Christ. And this was put down as a particular school of Christology. And then these letters that exist up on top here, if you look at this is the word Jesus Christ written out in Koine Greek, the original Gospels. And the way that they would abbreviate things a long time ago, they didn't use the first letter of a word. They would use the first letter and then the last letter. So if they wanted to abbreviate things, they would use these first and last letters. So if they wanted to abbreviate Jesus Christ, they would do this. Now this sigma character fell out of usage, and then it got replaced with a C. So you see this IC and this XC. And since this was a divinity, to abbreviate a divinity could be considered to be kind of blasphemous unless you put a special denote on it. And that was to put this thing called the tilde. And if you put this above an abbreviation for divinity, it was seen as an acceptable practice then to do the abbreviation. So this is saying Jesus Christ, and then I am who I am, identifying this particular school of Christology. You could also see this halos on people, and this guy sitting at the table, and he's got a black halo. Now, who do you guess might be sitting at this table of the Last Supper with a black halo? Well, you can make a good guess and say, maybe it is Jesus Iscariot, and you would be correct. Jesus Iscariot was typically pictured with a black halo. And you could see him over there in the right-hand corner with his bag of silver, 30 pieces of silver. Well, other question is, can animals have halos? Well, there's only 6 animals that are allowed to have halos. 4 of them are the writers of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the reason this kind of goes back to, there was a passage in Ezekiel where he refers to these 4 animals. And then there was an early Christian writer called Irenaeus who used those 4 animals to represent gospel writers. And everybody and their kid brother put different meanings on this. And so one of the more famous meanings applied to this was done by Jerome. We spoke about him last time when he was interpreting this thing about horns with Moses' Quran, the word Karen in Hebrew. But one of the interpretations is, the book of Matthew shows the lineage of Jesus and his humanity, so he's pictured as a person. There's the passage in Mark, voice cries out in the wilderness, cries out like a lion. Luke talks a lot about the sacrifice of Christ, so a bull was a key sacrificial animal. And Revelation, which was supposed to see things into the future, see the distance, you've got an eagle that could see from far up above, soaring, see out into the distance. The other 2 animals, besides these 4, are the Lamb of Christ, and of course it gets a cruciform halo because it represents Christ, and the dove of the Holy Spirit. And there are some more specialized halos. There's one for the Virgin Mary, a starry halo. She's typically pictured with stars. And not just any number of stars, but exactly 12 stars. Because in the book of Revelation, there's a passage in there that talks about Mary's assumption into heaven. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon, under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Now, you could also get another system they had was this idea of a full body halo, an aureola. And that's preserved for the Christ and Virgin Mary. And that's very popular with sculptors because they could kind of seat them within this kind of thing. Sometimes they call it tympanium, or the Italians called it mandorla, which in anybody that speaks Italian, that means almond. And that was the way they represented a halo. So they had this great system of all of these halos to put on various religious figures. But the problem was, if you got into a crowd scene, it turned into like Halo Palooza, trying to put all these regulation halos on everybody. And it got so bad that when you got a crowd scene, for all the halos, you couldn't even see the people that you're trying to depict in the crowd scene because of the halos. So they had to come up with some solution for this. So what artists started to do, they said, well, why don't we just kind of flatten the halos like hats? You know, and they walk around with these, they look like graduation hats, mortar hats on their head. And this is a picture of the scene from the Gospels where Jesus instructs Peter to get a coin from a fish and to pay tribute to the church. But this looked kind of dumb with people walking around with these kind of hats on their heads. So they said, well, we'll just make the halos very, very, very faint. And I don't know if you can see it here, but you have to look really closely, but these people have very, very, very faint halos on their heads. And it was so faint that no one could really even see it. So they started to say, well, maybe what we could do is imply a halo. So here's something called Mary Lactans, nursing the baby Jesus. And actually, this was outlawed. I'll speak about this next week, and religious art. And you can see they imply a halo with this kind of fan back here. Or in Da Vinci's Last Supper, he kind of implied a halo over here with a window. Or over here, you could see in this one, it's implied with this piece of cloth that goes around the head here. So all this stuff got to be so onerous that by the time the 1500s came around, people started to just leave off the halos entirely, and it started to become accepted practice from then on to it's okay to leave halos out. So that was everything you wanted to know about halos. And at this point, I'd like to conclude my talk and wish everyone a very happy Passover and Easter. And there is a part 3 of this class that if you want to join us next Saturday at this time at 1 o'clock, we'll be learning a lot more about some Hindu art and some other fascinating things on Christian art as well. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. My question has to do with the Arabic calligraphy, and when they were in that transition with their different calligraphy styles, one was a knotted style, I noticed, and I wondered if you might know, is there a connection to that knotted style of calligraphy and you know, the Celtic knot work that you see from, you know, like Scotland and Ireland? I mean, is there some connection there, or is that just coincidence?
I don't know the answers to that, but I would not be surprised if there wasn't a connection, because the Islamic Empire was very big on borrowing ideas from all over the world, from the Hindu culture, from the Chinese culture, from the African culture, and anything they could from the European cultures as well. So it wouldn't surprise me, though I don't know the answer of that definitively.
I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Be brave. I can unmute people if you unmute. There, you should be. Well, I can't get Brian unmuted, but I've got Joan and Marshall. You're unmuted if you have a question.
Nope.
No, we're set.
Just thank you, Jack, and thank you, Stacy, for bringing us these last 2 interesting presentations, and we'll certainly be watching next week.
Yes, we will.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited for next Saturday.
Okay, everybody take care.
Happy Easter, everyone.
Happy
Thank
Easter,
you.
happy Passover, and whatever religious holiday you celebrate at this time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.